Hey guys, and welcome back to another Spore and ZBrush video. For today, we're going to be going over my Vulture Scorpion, which I made for the Let's Make Hybrids community prompt for prompt number 5, I believe. So, the sculpt. Whereas with the Komodo Orca last time, I was tempted to make it Spore, like as a Spore creation alone, and ended up transitioning it into ZBrush. This time round, I made this with the absolute intention of putting it into ZBrush, and therefore the creation itself is kind of lazy and very, very basic. And I also mentioned in the actual prompt video itself that I was also really struggling on inspiration. So to go over that a little bit more then, like I said, I was really struggling on inspiration for this one. When the suggestion of a Vulture Scorpion hybrid was first brought up, I thought it sounded really cool. It sounded like it had a lot of potential to very different creatures, but not incredibly different where they couldn't be, mashed together. I could imagine people had like a very creative, opportunity with it, so I really liked it. But then, when it came to thinking of my own hybrids, I really just struggled. I just could not think of anything really too interesting. All I can think of really were just varieties of like manticores, griffins, centaurs, those kind of vibes, and I wasn't really that keen on any of them. I wanted something that, in a way, kind of combined things more than just, more than just a change of legs, or more than just added wings. So, like I said, played around with Spore first. Just played around. I was just trying to get like some manner of a creation in order. I wanted to start off with like a bird-like body, kind of go with like a bit of a cockatrice route. And in the end, as I was shaping out the tail, because the tail always has like a very, like a scorpion tail is always very upwards curving. And as I was doing that, and as I was getting ready to put the wings in place, it kind of occurred to me that having this in like some kind of posture would actually be quite interesting. Because like I said, I could not think of any sort of just idle posture. I just really was struggling with ideas on this one. But I didn't want to just, step out or give up. I really wanted to give my own submission to accompany all of yours. So, yeah, like I said, in the end, it occurred to me that some kind of battle posture may work out. When I was thinking about how I normally do my Spore wings, or like the wings and Spore, very large feathered ones, they're normally very open and outright, and it occurred to me that what I could try and do is some kind of threatening display where the wings are like really ruffled up and try to make the creature look as big as possible, and at the same time also have the stinger kind of looming over, ready to strike, or maybe like kind of like a cobra, where it's again like looming over, making itself bigger than it is, and again like still ready to strike. That's the idea I had in mind, so I went with that, and most of the work for that just really came down to the wings and the tail, and I guess the feet as well, like the posturing on the legs. But otherwise, as a Spore creation, it was extremely simple. So when it came to things like any detail, any features, the rest of them were extremely basic, knowing full well I would just go ahead and do it all in ZBrush anyway. So, for example, the pincers were very, very simple, and I thought about the pincers, by the way, because I saw these great big wings. It just felt like an opportunity to just slap on the pincers on top. At least that way it wouldn't just be bird wings alone, but it had like a bit of an addition to it. So I just slapped on the pincers, very, very simple ones with like the keratin horns, or keratin spikes, whatever they're called, just merged into the ethereal razor parts. Added a little spike onto the back of the feet as well, just to again give it just like a little bit extra in terms of features. And for the face and beak, well, it was just a beak. I didn't bother putting in any eyes. I didn't bother putting any details around the head. I did add like a little bit of a mane or like a ruff of feathers around the collarbone, as you do see in some vultures. I added a bit of that. Although admittedly, looking back on it, I think that in the actual ZBrush, I probably should have just made it manually, because when it came to translating the Spore details of the feathers, or the mane, into the ZBrush model, it felt really just weird, and I think I would have done better if I just made it from scratch. But hey though, I mean, that's the entire point of this, is that it's meant to be very relaxed. That's why I like importing Spore creations into ZBrush, is because it means I can then enhance the Spore creation, but at the same time have a very relaxed and laid-back ZBrush model. So for me, it really is a best of both worlds kind of thing. So, by the time I was about finished with my Spore model itself, I was ready to then export it out of Spore using the Kiilstofte export sheet and then import it into ZBrush. Same as before, if you want to know how to import Spore creations into your 3D software of choice, so Blender, ZBrush and Sculptress, I have a tutorial for that down in the video description down below. So yes, into ZBrush. The first protocol of having it in ZBrush was basically just to smoothen everything out. So I've been doing quite a fair few Spore sculpts recently. This Vulture Scorpion of the Spore sculpts is my 5th one. First one being Komodo Orca, second one being Horned Raptor, third one being Kiilstofte Dragon, which I think should be released as of recording this. Fourth one being Tiger and a Pigetta, which hasn't actually come out yet, and then this one being the 5th one. Like I said, I've just been on a huge Spore ZBrush binge recently. This one's the 5th one, and this one, I don't recall, I think this one's actually very, very relaxed with, like I'm looking on the footage now. I've just been doing so many drawings recently, I've kind of been going a bit back and forth over them all. For this one, I don't think I separated any of the harder areas, like the claws. There wasn't any teeth, it was a beak, but I kept in fact, yes, I kept everything to be the exact same subtool, which meant that everything was one large singular layer. That way, it's arguably a bit lazier, but it actually kind of worked out in the end, and you'll see why in about the texturing phase. When I coloured this in, it really made everything just match together perfectly. But before we get there then, so first thing I did was overall just kind of dynameshed the model at a very high resolution. I don't normally like starting sculpts in a high resolution because it's really hard to get it to like block out the form when it's, you know, super detailed. But because it's, you know, based on a Spore sculpt or a Spore model, if I'd done it in a very low resolution, then things would have just become very low polygon, very pixelated and very just, you know, blocky. I think a lot of you may have seen that one before, where it becomes like extremely simplified and just kind of like jarring. So again, had to done a mesh on a very high resolution and then smoothen everything out, get rid of all the nasty angles, make everything all round and curved. I had to thicken out some of the areas in the feathers, particularly the rear feathers and the base of the wings. That way things just kind of like get stitched up together better. It did admittedly give it like a bit of a clay texture, but that's okay though, because again, later on, like if we're following suit with the previous Spore ZBrush ones, they do all seem to have like a bit of a clay texture, where it looks like you could like physically hold it, as opposed to an organic creature, and I'm okay with that. It's the style that's been happening so far. It gives like a bit of a nice cartoonish style, which I think for a Spore thing is actually kind of required. And otherwise, after I was pretty much happy just stitching everything together, making sure the model itself was functional before adding in the detail, and then I moved on to the head. So for the head, for the face, first of all, I just made the beak a lot more just bigger. I gave it a bottom jaw because the Spore variant was really lacking, so I just chopped off the entire bottom jaw of the beak, added in a new one, much more narrow and thinner, and actually curves along with it, better in terms of sizing, and then just added like a bit of work to the head, such as the eye socket, a bit of an eyebrow, just a very, very basic. And then after that, it was a case of stitching up the rest of the creation, adding some musculature, particularly around the hips, because as we all know by now with Spore has very, very bulbous limbs, especially when you attach it to the spine or to the body of the creature. It just creates this really ugly round surface, so I had to, of course, add some musculature there and make sure that the hip actually was attached to the creature and not just randomly, you know, stitched on. And after that, it was just a case of improving the mane around the chest. Like I said earlier, the chesty feathery area I added in Spore ended up being really quite jarring. I wasn't really sure just like how to visually texture it in terms of the sculpt, because I didn't want to do like lots and lots of individual feathers. And I really didn't want to use alphas either. Like sometimes I use like a lot of pre-made tools or a lot of alphas to like give the effect of feathers, and this time I just really wasn't feeling it. It just felt, sometimes I feel like they can be very messy, I guess is probably the best word I can use. So this time round, what I ended up doing was just using the move tool and just pulling these little spikes out. Now the spikes were really ugly. I didn't like them, but I kept with it because I had an idea in mind and I wanted to experiment and see if the idea worked. So after pulling out all these individual areas, including around the back as well and then somewhat into the wings, I then used the clay polish tool and just drew on top of like every individual kind of spiky area, if you will, and did like a bit of a technique that a lot of people use to sculpt hair. And I'll say sculpt, you know, I really emphasize that word, because when you sculpt hair, like generally like a hairstyle or fur in ZBrush, you want to try and give it the appearance of what you would see like in a statue. If you ever go to a museum and see like a large physical sculpture of, say, human head, you'll see that the hairstyle is like very, again, like just very, very sculpted. It's kind of hard to describe, but I hope that you understand, you know, the comparison of a real life statue, and that's the kind of thing I was trying to go for with the feathers here, to try and somewhat get that same style. Very rough, very different, but kind of the same thing. And in the end, a bit of trial and error, it kind of worked out in the end. It does make it look very thick and fluffy, which for feathers isn't really that accurate. But again, still sticking to the whole clay style, I think it worked out for the theme of the creation, for the theme of the models, and the overall, you know, kind of technique I'm going for. I think it worked out for what I wanted, and in the end, that's kind of the important part, isn't it? I was able to obtain my goal, and that's, you know, that's good. That's kind of what you want as an artist, to be able to, you know, do what's in your imagination. Anyway, enough obsessing over the feathers. So after that, I then just refined the face a little bit more, just gave it a little bit more definition. I then made the scorpion tail just a little bit sharper around the edges, a little bit more chitin-y. Added a bit of fluff and feathers around the thighs as well, just to make them not look quite as bland and simple. Made the pincers kind of float into the wings a bit better as well, as for quite a while they just looked like just weirdly bulbous. I did experiment with adding, I've seen like in some vultures they have like these little tufty parts coming ahead of their eyes and down past their beak. Kind of like, in a way, kind of like the black stripes on a cheetah, but in like feathery form, feathery stick-outy form. I did experiment with that, but in the end it just didn't really seem to be working in this creature. So I'll skip that out in the end. And then after a while, so once I was happy with the overall form, I had another look at the wings, and they just felt really vague. So, just like my recent horned raptor sculpt, I really didn't want to make like big complex feathered wings, because that just would have taken a lot of time and it just would have looked very weird in contrast to the rest of the sculpt. But the base of the wings, the arms, just felt really naked, really just bland and boring. So in the end I kind of elected to just adding in all these, honestly, just for a lack of a better term, I just added in all these little lumps and bumps all over the place. And I actually really quite liked it after a while. I don't specifically know what it is that I've drawn. I don't know if they're like meant to be, you know, tufts of feathers or tufts of fur, or if they're like bits of exoskeleton armor. I really just did not think too much about it. I just liked the way it visually looked and kept on pushing it throughout the creation. And then when we get into the texturing phase, I again kept it somewhat vague and purposefully made the scorpion parts and the vulture parts as fairly similar coloration. That way it could really be taken down to interpretation. That way, you know, one person may interpret it, for example, the base of the wings. One person may interpret it as feathers, another may interpret it as exoskeleton armor, another may interpret it as fur. It's okay, I don't mind that. I don't mind it being down to interpretation, because at the end of the day, it just made for like a very interesting visual appearance. The same with the underbelly as well. The underbelly does look very scaly, I will admit. But again, you know, someone might think otherwise, and that's okay. So, when I was finished with the overall sculpting, I really liked just the general kind of very round, very soft appearance it had. It then came down to the colouring. For the colouring, initially, I was thinking of going for like some kind of black and white vulture or something, you know, like very stereotypical. But then I wasn't really quite sure. I was trying to look out some like various references of just scorpions and vultures, and in the end I tried to go for like a griffin vulture and an emperor scorpion. And it was interesting. So my general thought process here was I was going to have like a very brown creature. That was the idea, very brown. And the first thing I wanted to do was colour out the tail, because I had the idea that in order to kind of make the tail look like these individual segmented parts, I thought to myself I'd have like this golden outline in between. Where did the gold come from? I'm not really sure, I just wanted like a nice bright colour. I had those in between the outlines, and then just had the rest of the exoskeleton just kind of this transition of dark brown and brown. I wish I could say where the idea came from, but honestly it just came to me. It was just one of those in the moment inspirations. And I ended up trying to apply that to the legs as well, or the feet, because again I really liked the gold outlines. I thought they just suited it really well, really made it pop. So I tried to mimic the same thing again with the feet, and then once the gold outline was in place, not to mention the gold underside of the foot, I then added another layer of like darker brown on top, and it looked very similar to the tail, and I really liked it, because when I first created the feet, I had the idea of it just being, you know, very typical avian feet. But then when I started texturing it, it looked like exoskeleton armor, and I really, really liked it. It had that same chitin feeling, or chitin feeling, as the scorpion parts. It felt very segmented. So at this point, it was actually really beneficial that I didn't bother to detach the claws as I normally would. Normally I'd make the claws their own separate subtool, separate layer, change the material, make them pure white, and make them really stand out. But in this case, I was lazy and I kept the claws attached to the foot into this one large singular tool, and it really worked out because then it meant that I could then continue to segment and texture it all as one big thing. And now these feet, or the claws, don't really look like claws anymore. They look like just not really pincers. They just, again, just look like exoskeleton armor, just fashioned into claws. Like I said, it's kind of hard to describe, but that was my thought process, and I just really like how it came out. And it again, you know, really blurs the line between, you know, is it Vulture? Is it Scorpion? You know, where does it start and where does it end? It really blurs that line, and I really liked that. I wanted to keep on pushing that. So I then applied that same logic and texture to the pincers on the wings and to the beak. So basically every surface that would have had like a really harsh material would have then be the same colours. And then looking at it from a distance, all that dark and all that gold, I then applied that to the wings and made the wings very dark as well. But then the entire thing started feeling very dark, and I wanted to add like a bit of highlighting, so I added like this nice cream yellowish colour around the mane in particular, you know, trying to bring back a bit more Vulture into the colour scheme. And I've seen that quite a few Vultures do have like these rather lightly coloured manes. But then when I did that, it felt a bit too bright. So I had to add in like various little low lights and various dark splotches and kind of make it all like a little bit multicoloured, and I kind of liked the direction that was going. So then I applied that to the rest of the model, just had like all these different shades of various browns, greys, blacks and creams. But while still keeping it as low complexity as possible, still try to make it like just very, very round, very fluffy, very vague. And then as we got towards the end, because I was live streaming it, I had the suggestion of adding some blue highlights, and that was just the final perfect touch that this required. It felt like something was missing, and adding in these really vivid blue highlights, that was it. That was the creation complete, and I was really, really happy with it from then on. So I added the blue tips initially to the tip of the feathers, just to really make the feathers highlight out, and then I elected to put it onto the tip of the stinger, claws and pincers. But not the beak. I decided against the beak because I felt like that was getting a bit too repetitive, and instead I wanted a bright blue tongue, or bright blue mouth, purely because in a lot of my commissions I've had people request their models to have like these brightly coloured neon mouths, and it's something that I've never tried myself. I never really know when to do it because it often feels a little bit out of place to me sometimes. So I tried it here, and it was good. It was just that slight difference. Instead of having a blue beak, it had a blue mouth, and that was it. It was as simple as that. And like I said, I just really, really liked how it came out in the end. So there you go then. An extremely rambly process, but as I mentioned from the beginning, I really struggled with inspiration on this one, and I know that when it comes to these hybrid prompts, a lot of people have been struggling on inspiration and ideas. A lot of people have been inspired, but some have been like a bit too far out of their comfort zones, and so was I here. But that being said though, I still tried. I ended up trying a lot of things differently than I normally would, such as focusing on the posture and less on the creature. Certain ways that I hybridized the two features I wouldn't normally do, like I'd never normally put pincers on wings, that just sounds weird. But in this case, in conjunction with the posture, it kind of worked. And yeah, like I said, hopefully it's something that others can find a bit inspiring. A lot of this model and creation and texturing just kind of made itself. Like the more I progressed on, the more inspiration came to me at the time, and the more I was able just to, you know, progress it, keep on going, and come to a finish that really surprised me. It's an old saying, you know, as I say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. It's worth trying. You never know what you might get if you just give it a try. And with that, my friends, I say thank you very much for listening. Thank you for watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned a couple of things in the process and might be a little bit more tempted to get out your comfort zones. I certainly am grateful that I did. And I will see you all next time. Have a wonderful day, and take care.